situation. I need everybody to sit down. It's going to look worse than it is. Have people coming on that aren't, we've all been watching the news, so they look like they're in a bubble.
They're all, everybody's
Hey everybody, I'm Christopher Greene and you're tuning into AMTV, Alternative Media Television. I believe the spread of the deadly Ebola virus that took root in West Africa, sub-Saharan countries, namely originating in Guinea, Sierra Leone, and then spreading to other countries like Nigeria, is a bioweapon. I think the United States federal government is behind it. In fact, I did a very specific documentary to this. I encourage you to watch, link in the description box, Ebola, the truth about the outbreak. And this is 2014, and these are serious allegations. But I know historically the United States federal government has been behind these types of Orwellian plots to study deadly viruses and deadly diseases. Now, over the weekend, the second nurse, not the one in Spain who already contracted the disease wearing a full hazmat suit, but a second nurse treating Thomas Eric Duncan, who recently died, who was doing so well according to head of the CDC, Tom Frieden, that he croaked. They were so optimistic of his recovery that he died. But a second nurse, not the one in Spain, but a new one, a second nurse in Dallas, who was also treating Thomas Eric Duncan in full protective gear, one of those freakish-looking hazmat suits of which the U.S. State Department has ordered over 160,000 units, mysteriously prior to the outbreak, still contracted the disease. Yet the CDC wants us to believe that the virus isn't airborne, or at the very least it's being transmitted by other methods. Now, there's been only 2 times in my recent memory, since I've been alive, where a government official has told me and told the general public not to panic. The first time was in 2008 with George W. Bush, right before the deadliest stock market crash in the history of the world that wiped out trillions and trillions of dollars from the U.S. and global economy, and then resulted in multi-trillion dollar bailouts and 0% interest rates that are still in effect today. Not to mention millions and millions of foreclosures, bankruptcies, and just utter chaos, not just on Wall Street, but mostly Main Street. Now the second time, CDC Director Tom Frieden is telling you and me not to panic about Ebola. Well, I don't know about you, but when my leadership tells me not to panic, I panic because it means they're lying to you. It means they're lying to us. They're lying to me. And again, this disease does not appear to be one of the old strains. Doesn't appear to be Zaire, because we now have 2 nurses that knew they were around the virus, taking extreme precaution, wearing fancy hazmat suits that were aware they were treating this deadly, virulent disease, that have now mysteriously come down with the virus. Again, put 2 and 2 together, that doesn't make sense at all. I mean, hey, if a hazmat suit doesn't work, then why wear one at all? Now, if these nurses are contracting the disease wearing full protective gear, imagine how many people have also contracted the disease prior to Thomas Eric Duncan even arriving at the hospital. They had quarantined over 100, but you can only imagine there's potentially hundreds, if not thousands, if not tens of thousands, if not soon to be millions, maybe tens of millions of Americans who have already contracted the disease. And again, I believe it's a bioweapon, folks. Why would the United States continue to keep our borders open? Why would they not stop incoming flights from the affected Ebola hot zone? Why would the president simply just check a temperature as these people are entering the United States? Remember, Thomas Eric Duncan wasn't showing a temperature when he came to the U.S. He was fine. He was still in the incubation period. And again, I'll ask the question, how many more Thomas Eric Duncans are there that we don't know about? Again, there's been very many historical examples throughout history where the U.S. government has specifically, knowingly infected patients with a virulent and or deadly disease. One such case was the Tuskegee example that I cited in my documentary, where the U.S. Public Health Service actually knowingly infected patients with the syphilis virus and told them they were actually receiving free health care, but when in reality they were knowingly infecting these patients with the disease. 201 of them, of the, I believe, 500 or 700 that they had under study at the time, going over a 40-year period, they actually infected them to study the natural progression of the disease, targeted specifically rural African-American black men. Kind of like what's happening now in sub-Saharan Africa. You know, it's not me, it's declassified reports like the memorandum that I showed in the documentary, where Henry Kissinger, famous for quoting that depopulation is in the best interest of the American people. These declassified documents with, on the header, attention to the President and the Department of Defense, people like the Secretary of State, etc., talking about unmitigated population growth in this part of the world where the Ebola virus just happens to be situated is an extreme national security risk to the United States federal government. You see, the U.S. federal government has a self-interest in this disease. Not only do they have a self-interest in controlling the potentially unmitigated population growth in these third world countries, of course, natural resources, there's ore, there's all kinds of things that we want in this part of the world, but they also happen to own, the CDC, a government agency, own the patent to the deadly Ebola virus and 70% of its mutated, potentially mutated strains. Again, this virus, and let me preference, I'm not a scientist, but this virus isn't following the natural progression or course of the Zaire strain. It looks and appears to be something completely different. Again, the second nurse here over the weekend contracting the disease wearing a full hazmat suit. Again, if the hazmat suits don't work, then why even wear a hazmat suit? The head of the CDC, Tom Frieden, calling this the worst outbreak since AIDS. And the President of the United States, in the meantime, calling it an unlikely event several months ago. People like me here at AMTV and some others out in the blogosphere telling you that you should be extremely worried. That if they're telling you not to panic, you should panic. That by keeping our borders open, the disease will spread here to the United States of America. And it's exactly what's happened. Again, this isn't rocket science. Even if the federal government had their best intentions, they're going to screw it up. People are going to continue to flood over our border and infect innocent Americans, unknowingly or not. But the actions by the President, by the administration, a report I read this morning blaming the GOP on the outbreak, just shows how politicized this event actually is. Again, Obama's unlikely event is now as likely and as real and fatal as the deadly Ebola virus itself, with a very high kill rate. And again, I'll ask the question, how is this not manslaughter? You know, if you were to drink a six-pack and then shoot a bunch of Jack Daniels and mistakenly go kill a family of 4, driving illegally while drunk, you would be prosecuted under the full extent of the law, if not receive the death penalty for that action. Yet the President does the same things on behalf of thousands, tens of thousands, maybe millions of Americans that are now not only exposed to the deadly virus, but will assuredly die. Again, this thing has a 50 to 75% kill rate, folks, an incubation period anywhere between 2 to 21 days. Again, personally me, I think that this is a bioweapon. And remember, it's not me that always fearmongers around this. It's your government that has been fearmongering about terrorism and bioweapons for several decades now, with the passage of the Patriot Act, the September 2001 terror attack cover-up, the Boston bombings. It's your government that constantly fearmongers you into submission, saying that bioterror is a very significant threat, that EMPs are a very significant threat to the national security of the United States. Yet we have a virus, a deadly virus spreading now that is uncharacteristically showing and not matching, in my opinion, to previous strains, the most well-known strains like the Zaire form, with nurses wearing full-blown hazmat suits coming down with the deadly disease and virus when they know that they're operating around such a sinister disease. Again, none of it adds up, none of it makes sense unless there's intention behind it. Again, there's either gross intention to murder innocents, to infect knowingly Americans here in the United States, just like the Tuskegee experiment, the famous experiment that ran for 40 years, where the U.S. Public Health Service and the federal government knowingly infected African-American men with syphilis to study it. Fact. Not hearsay, not a conspiracy. It's either that, it's either malicious intent, again, to control the unmitigated population growth in that part of the world, sub-Saharan African nations in West Africa, African-American men, women, and children, or it's gross incompetence. And either way, it's manslaughter, it's death, it's chaos. And it's all being brought to you by the President of the United States, our government officials both at the right and the left of Washington, D.C. today. Again, folks, I believe this to be a bioweapon. Get it out everywhere, make it viral, hard-hitting in your face. Watch my documentary, Ebola, The Truth About the Outbreak, in the description box below. And please support our sponsor.